So to kickstart us off, I've actually got a question for all the panel. Just to get us started, what is your involvement with respectful relationships education, and what do you see as the most significant shift or milestone in this work to date? Jan, I might start with you.
I just want to start first by just prefacing, I have rural practice wisdom, but so do many other people in this room. So I just want to acknowledge all the other people that speak with or deliver this work in a rural context. I'm certainly not an expert and I'm not an academic, so that's where I'm coming from when I speak today. I think obviously funding has made the biggest difference to it. I think the value that's been given to it through that funding has made a significant impact in how it's delivered. The isolation aspect rurally has always been my comments when I've participated in anything at DVRCV, that isolation as practitioners and also, you know, some of the isolation of schools. So I think there's definitely been a change, a significant change with a much more coordinated approach.
Thanks, Jen. Alison?
Well, I think it's exciting because for years, so for long before we ever had a framework for guiding primary prevention of violence against women, or before it was government policy, there's been a dialogue about the need to work with young people and children in schools to influence the attitudes and behaviours that give rise to violence against women. So I think the most exciting aspect of the work and where we are now is that we're moving from it being the purview of a small specialist sector into the mainstream, which is exactly where it needs to be.
I am the project lead for Barwon area, so I'm currently working with 11 lead schools and 45 partner schools across 5 local government areas, which is a pretty unique role, and something, I guess, the role itself has been created just recently through the significant investment from the Royal Commission. So for me, I think one of the biggest shifts that we've seen is the consistency and the having so many schools, over 1,000 schools, working from an evidence base and having on-the-ground support, which has been, every time we speak to schools about what has enabled the success, it's about having people sit down, support in the audits and action plans, and come out and speak with their students, their families or teachers and deliver PD. So for me, I think it's just about being able to have such an incredible workforce, and many of my peers are here today on the ground with schools.
My name's Jeremy Ludowyke. My personal involvement in working around prevention in gender-based violence goes back to a group called MASA, Men Against Sexual Assault, who worked in collaboration with the CASAs back in the 1980s. My professional involvement goes back to an initiative of the Office of the Status of Women, if people remember that entity, now no longer existing, which was the production of a material kit called the No Fear Kit, which was a whole school, and the first whole school approach to addressing gender-based violence in 1995. Melbourne High School is a lead school, one of the first lead schools of the Respectful Relationship program. We have previous to that been involved not only in the Safe Schools Network, but also with the White Ribbon campaign. And what I would say is that the Respectful Relationship framework is a unique opportunity because it is mandated, and therefore it does give access to each and every school in the state of Victoria, and that it is based on a whole school approach, and I might talk later about why I think that's very important.
Okay, I think it's always hard going last, especially with the panel that we've got here. It's just fantastic, the diversity and the experience that's in this area, and I think that for me, that is the most significant change. Jan spoke before about the isolation of being a practitioner in a regional area, and there's now a formal architecture that's developing and can be strengthened, but that can actually link schools and practitioners to that. So for me, it's really that our reach and our community of practitioners and community of contributors to the prevention of violence against women has just grown so much. I know that this conference itself sold out in a couple of days. So to think if you could have got a bigger hall, though that would have been terrifying for all of us here, we could potentially have 600-700 people who are all working and connected to prevention in Victoria and looking for that generational change. It's just so exciting.
Jeremy, I wanted to start with you because I was thinking about the order of questions and I thought, let's start at the local level with your experience from a school's perspective. What do you think's changed since the commencement of the DET Respectful Relationships Initiative?
I think I mentioned before how significant the focus on a whole school approach is, and I think that is critical. A good example of that is the experience of our own school, where you're going to need to start by cleaning up your own backyard. And so the initial work we did was with our staff. Before we were going to roll this out to our community and talk to parents and students, we needed to make sure that there was a common understanding amongst the staff of the school. Like any change, there's going to be about 30 to 40% of people who immediately get what this is about. There's going to be, as there is in any organisation or any community, a proportion, whatever that proportion might be, who are going to be antithetical to the change, particularly when you're talking about massive social change, and we are. And then there is the group in the middle. And the advice always around change would be that small group, hopefully, of people who are going to resist change. You could exhaust all your energy trying to convince them, and it will probably be energy that will dissipate your initiative. The focus, if anything, is on that group in the middle. And if you can develop a critical mass for change out of that group in the middle, which is what our experience was, then you have the capacity for change. So that's one element of what we learnt, which I'd also be encouraging all of the agencies represented here today to work with schools around. And then you also need to be taking on the readiness of your whole community for responding to the fact that you are going to lead them through a process of change. And that's also a very difficult proposition.
It's interesting because one of the top rating questions that I'm seeing coming through was just about that, how you've managed the experience of backlash potentially from students or parents, and if so, kind of how you responded. I feel like you've touched on that a bit there. And Jeremy at Melbourne High School is one of the lead schools, and as you saw from the presentation earlier, I think there's 151 lead schools across the state, and then a number of partner schools that work really closely with those. Jeremy, what's been your experience as a lead school, and particularly kind of what's your responsibility to the partner schools that you're working with?
I think this is one element of the program which we really do need to further engineer. Schools forever and a day are used to working in networks and connection with each other, but one of the things that inevitably is going to happen with the respectful relationship is that they will not necessarily work around a pre-existing network or partnership between schools. These are often a network that's being created entirely around the respectful relationship framework. So that of itself is going to mean that you're going to need to build that network and community of support from the ground up. As a 9 to 12 school, and we're fairly sort of unusual in that regard, we're also not a neighbourhood or a community school. So although the schools are relatively close to us geographically, we don't necessarily work within and share the same community. And that's even an issue in terms of the multi-sectorialness, because they will be working with different other sector connections and networks, which we will not necessarily share. Our own experience is that it's been far more effective working like with like. Our dynamic and the work that we have done with other secondary schools has been, I think, to date, far more effective than the work we've done in primary schools. And that may be peculiar to us as a 9 to 12 school. We are clearly more remote from primary schools, nor do we have as direct network of link naturally with them in any case. The one thing we have learned, though, is that the value of bringing them together rather than working one-on-one and bringing them together where you can begin to build both a partnership and a collective understanding through running forums, and we've run a couple, And I have to acknowledge the work of the assistant principal, Melissa Salamidas, who's in the audience today, because she's been the major driver of that. And we've found far more momentum coming out of bringing the schools together rather than trying to work with them one-on-one.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think that's a good segue to speak with Ash, who, as project lead in the Barwon region, we've worked very closely with the 34 staff that are the project leads and the liaison officers, and think that it's been really critical in the mainstreaming of this work. How many schools are you currently working with and supporting, and how manageable has that been?
So I said before, we have 11 lead schools and 45 partner schools, so it's about 56. I certainly have colleagues of mine that have a higher number of schools or who have a much greater distance of travel. Obviously, when we have 17 areas, it all looks a bit different for each of us. I think the thing that's probably there for all of us is that we are all working extremely hard to support our schools, and it's a real test of our time management and to be as efficient, as effective as possible. Often I'm driving an hour and a half to most of our schools, so 3 hours in a day to visit a couple of schools has its toll, I think, on us. But again, some of our counterparts are travelling much further distance as well. We've had to work efficiently, like Jeremy said. We group schools together. We deliver PD in areas where they have schools that they can invite their like-minded and group of schools together, whether that's around geography clusters that we've developed or whether it's around our communities of practice in terms of the leads supporting their partner schools. I think that it's hard to be one of 34 staff up here talking because all of our work looks really, really different in each area. And I think that we have a few things in the Barwon area that make it quite unique for us. So I think there's things like we've been seeing a lot of success from the support from Geelong Football Club. I think being a one-club town can be really fantastic. We also have a lot of community organisations that have done a lot of work both in prevention and in response, including systems mapping and things like that. So I think that it makes our job really quite amazing, but I think it looks different in every area. So it is really about using our time as much as effectively as possible, using technology. We do lots of our planning in the car. Really, I think a lot of our good conversation with Kate, my colleague, and myself was in the car. And again, some of our area teams are actually based in different offices. So it's an interesting thing. So I really encourage you to speak to your Respectful Relationships workforce here today, because we are doing things quite differently, but it's about consistency within that flexibility. So, yeah.
And Ash, what's some of the support that you're giving schools on the ground? What are they looking for when they call you up and kind of want to work with you?
So I recently sat down and did a bit of a SWOT analysis with our lead schools, which was, I think, just to really try and unpack what's supported our schools most with implementation of the whole school approach. It came out really strongly in that it's the practical support, it's the sitting down on the ground with our schools and supporting them to unpack the audit, unpack what gender equity means, what the whole school approach is. We've been doing a lot of work on sort of co-facilitating planning days, so developing a team roles, aligning to school values and aligning to other whole school approaches that schools might be undertaking as well. Sort of supporting around managing resistance, both within the staff or students or wider community. And I think it's about aligning messages and getting a narrative that works best for schools. The other thing that when we've talked to schools about what was useful, it's really about the PD and having the grants to be able to have CRT to come out and spend a day with us, which is pretty amazing. So we'll often go out to a school and run a whole planning day with their whole team, with curriculum leaders and people from each learning community, or have teachers come out and do a whole day PD, which is incredible. And that's from the investment from our state government, obviously being able to enable that. The other really positive thing that came out of the conversations we had around what's been, I guess, supporting success was we've set up a key contact kind of network. It really acts as a mini steering committee for our work locally, and that group of lead contacts from our schools to come together and be able to say what's really useful, what do you need, are we hitting the mark, do we need to change what we're doing? And obviously we're doing that on a statewide level, but we've been doing that on a mini Barwon level as well, and just really trying to make sure we're hitting the mark, which has been great. So our days look different, facilitating training. Tonight I'm in a sporting club doing some training around diversity with football netball clubs. So we're really aligning with our community organisations and community clubs as well to curriculum planning and assessment and stuff as well. So it's a pretty big job that we have with lots of different areas, but yeah, the student voice work has been fantastic, and family engagement as well.
Thanks, Ash. I was just looking at our Slido, and we're getting some really good engagement there. Keep those questions coming, because I'll come back to them in a minute. Jan, I wanted to jump to you. In your bio, mentioned you've been involved with this work for over a decade, and I kind of want you to sort of hover back pre the last 2 years when we've kind of had the mainstream approach. What was some of the challenges of doing respectful relationships work before it's been mainstreamed and scaled up from a community perspective?
I think Gippsland Women's Health made a commitment 10 years ago to work on a project that was actually funded. We got lots of little bits of funding, so we got a little bit from a primary care partnership and a little bit from Vic Health and a little bit from somewhere else. And so we put it all together and we developed a project called, I think it was Schools and Family Violence and Schools Project. And right from the start, as we started working with schools, we realised that the whole school approach, and I'm not even sure if that terminology was there then, was how we had to deliver it, because when you're talking rural communities, you're talking about the community that the school is the community. So, and often the school is the only thing in the community. So we worked with a lot of we worked with several schools over a couple of years, and things like language, when we went to schools, we were asked to modify language, so we weren't allowed. We were asked not to call it Family Violence in Schools Project, so we had to look at other language to use because family violence wasn't about schools. I think that we had very limited school buy-in, and it was often by one person, and sometimes that person wasn't in a position to be able to, lead it or direct it within the school. So we'd start working with the school and realise that we were just continuously getting put off and asked to do things in a different way, and so really challenging what we were doing, and the isolation factor for the sole worker delivering it, the isolation just because we were driving sometimes 3 hours to work with a school, and but also the isolation that we weren't surrounded. I used to come down to the PIP network meetings and feel quite envious of the people that would have had conversations in the corridors with other colleagues, because we didn't have any of that. It was very much a sole position role. So I think that, for me, that was sort of a big part of it. I think
Thanks.
that's, good picture of it.
No, it's great, Jan. And I've got another question for you in a minute, a bit more about the rural context. Yep. But, Cara, I wanted to turn to you and just hover up a little bit. The rollout was an opportunity for a significant contribution into expansion of the evidence base around respectful relationships education. building on the 2009 work and the Our Watch's Respect for Relationships Education in Schools pilot, or REASE pilot, how closely does the Department of Ed's current model reflect the model and recommendations of the REASE pilot?
Look, there's a lot of similarities, and that's, I think, how the next step in mainstreaming or scaling up should look. It should be drawing on the evidence base that's been proven by a more sort of tightly held pilot. But the reality is that in the space of a couple of years, we've jumped from 19 schools to 1,000. So things have to change. It's really quite easy might not be the word, it's really fun designing a pilot or even a large-scale model on paper or on the whiteboard, and you're thinking big and you're thinking about all the great things that could happen. But as soon as you apply the reality to that, everyone is individual. They've all got their own lives that sort of start to interact with that. Every school is different, and so it should be, because it's serving a unique community. Every teacher is different, every principal, and the reality of the world sits and disrupts your perfect little model that you may have brought up. The rollout does look really similar. The beautiful multicolour wheel that we've seen several times here, it's the same image we were using 5 years ago, I think, with the same quality of design 5 years ago as well. And when we sort of look at the workforce, it's very similar to what Emily was discussing earlier today with the project implementation leads in the pilot. They were based in the DET regional offices. But again, the step up from there, Anne Nichols is somewhere in the room today, and she was one of the project implementation leads. I think she had 8 schools that she was working with. Ash, how many schools do you have? 56, if you didn't hear that in her teacher voice. So the reality of how you can do this en masse just has to, by the reality of the world, change the model. And I think with the additional 2 years of funding that's just been announced, it'll be really fantastic to be able to look at where that next 2 years can take us.
Cara, your work with Our Watch, you're also running a program at the moment up in Queensland with the Queensland Department of Education. And you're also involved in the National Respect for Relationships Advisory Group, or you convene that through Our Watch. Talking about the advice, or let me just go to my question, some of the important considerations for other states and territories in the learnings from the Victorian initiative.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've got some university people in the room, including Universities Australia. So I think they'll be very proud to see this good OH&S and safety precautions here at RMIT if we do have to get evacuated. So Our Watch is obviously a national organisation. We're actually, the majority of state and territory and Commonwealth governments are our members. So our role is to support them and to support the prevention sector and practitioners across Australia to build on quality prevention practice. So we have a group that we're very imaginative. It's called the National Respect for Relationships Education Expert Group. We call it NAREG for short. It brings together every Department of Education in Australia, as well as key national education stakeholders like Cara, Education Services Australia, ACFA, I'll go into some weird acronyms now, but also some key not-for-profit stakeholders like NAPCAN and White Ribbon, Mayan and Youth Peaks. This is a really important group for us because a couple of years ago when Victoria was leading the way nationally, other states were looking at what they could be doing around respect for relationships education. And lo and behold, they're all doing pretty much the same thing with their different geography, their different resourcing and their different policy environments. So it was really fantastic for us to have the opportunity to bring that group together. We've now had, I think, 3 or 4 meetings We've had a presentation from Victoria, I think that was at the first meeting, discussing the workforce and the regional architecture that was being delivered through this, through the statewide rollout here. We've heard from Tasmania and the consultation that they did with their teaching and their principal workforce before developing a whole school approach. We've heard from Queensland and the way that they've been developing their work and trying to support rollout across the state with very little resources and geography challenges that we do not have in Victoria. And we're going to hear from the other states. We've also heard from Commonwealth and the role of the Commonwealth in trying to support states and territories through the education departments and developing any gaps that there might be. I think every state and territory is probably a bit envious, and I think envious of Justin sitting over there with how much resourcing they get to have around this area. And, you know, they've definitely been pulling and wanting to learn more and be connected more to the workforce here to understand it. In Queensland, we're really lucky. We've got an Our Watch staff person who's actually based in the Department of Education there for the next couple of years, so it's an ongoing partnership. And she's working with 10 primary schools in the southeast region, supporting them to adapt the whole school approach, drawing largely from the Reece pilot model and the Victorian model. So it is that Victoria has the most established evidence base. The pilot was evaluated and we've got the evaluation of the rollout here. But I do think that all states and territories get to learn off each other's work and the way that this rolls out. You know, it is really interesting, our federated model of delivering education. There are similarities, there are umbrellas like our Australian curriculum, but there is just unique diversity in every state, every territory, every region and every school.
Thanks, Cara. Alison, from your perspective as our representative from Domestic Violence Victoria, at the statewide peak representing the specialist women's and children's services sector, we know that when we're doing prevention work, disclosures will increase, and it's really important that we plan for that. From your experience with the membership of DVVic, what have you observed or heard about the impacts on the sector as a result of the rollout?
I do think it's still early days in terms of being able to measure the impact on the specialist service system, and I don't know that we've necessarily got reliable data or indeed the proper data collection systems to help us understand that, whether there's yet a notable flow onto the service system. But we do know that across the board, when we have any new prevention and awareness raising activities, that it does have a flow onto the service system. So we see this when we have, you know, broad scale community awareness raising primary prevention programs, for example. So it's why we have for years been advocating that with any primary prevention initiative and including respectful relationships, you need to plan right from the inception for the flow on to the response sector, for the flow on to the services that work directly with people affected by family violence. But it's not just about planning from the very beginning for this projected demand, it's actually about planning from the beginning for the development of working relationships, for partnerships to be developed right from the beginning of program planning. And the other thing I just wanted to note on that is that this kind of work can't just happen by osmosis. It has to be resourced. It's the work of driving integration, and it must be built in right from the beginning.
Alison, do you have any examples of those kind of partnerships working well within the rollout between?
Yes, I do.
I'm jumping
around. A good example of a partnership that I'm aware of is in the Eastern Metro region. So I think after the evaluation of the pilot that ran out there was the local agency contacted the Department of Education to discuss how they could support schools with handling disclosures, because we know that when children and young people disclose family violence or disclose the factors that indicate its presence, that a lot of people don't know what to do or what to say. It's common that people receive advice or responses that fail to recognise the risk that they're at, and it's that they can fail to recognise the support that's required, and at worst can be dismissive or minimalise those experiences. So we know from Victoria's Royal Commission into Family Violence that it very, very clearly said that the work of preventing and responding to family violence sits well beyond the specialist system, and indeed that schools have a key role to play. So I think it's important to note that teachers and other staff within schools, within the whole of school response, shouldn't be expected to act outside the bounds of their professional roles. But it is really important that if we're going to start, if we are opening up a dialogue about violence and the abuse of power and control within relationships, we need the people that are delivering those programs to be able to handle the disclosures that may elicit. So in the eastern region, we know that there was a partnership developed where training has been provided. I think that has now opened up a much broader partnership, and they're looking at their health promotion team going in and delivering some quite innovative programs. I spoke to them just recently, and they said what was really interesting was in the first week after the program's delivery, they actually had 9 referrals into the service that came from the 3 leader schools, and that there were that included actually 2 referrals that went straight into the high-risk multi-agency risk assessment and risk management panel. So they're the multi-agency responses that work with women and children who are at high risk of being killed or experiencing significant harm. So I think that was a really interesting sort of small amount of evidence.
Yeah. One of the themes that we'll be exploring more in the breakout session is how, as you mainstream a prevention initiative, you also make sure that you're tailoring it to specific communities or population groups or areas. Jan, obviously working in a regional area in outer Gippsland, you've been doing people work in sort of these regional rural communities for some time, and you've spoken a lot about this through the Partners in Prevention Network. What are some of the key considerations for adapting and embedding respectful relationships within rural and remote contexts?
I guess just to give a picture of a bit of a rural community. So in far east Gippsland, we have 3 really distinct areas. We've got Bensdale, which is quite a regional town. And then you've got Orbost, which is a small community, timber community, and then you've got places like Benambra or Bonang, which is just like 3 hours drive at least from Sale on Shingle Road. So it's really important that each one of these is really different. So earlier this year, a colleague and I drove up to Bonang to just sort of connect with the community, find out a little bit about gender equality up there. And we had a 3-hour drive. After the first hour and a half, we lost contact with the outside world. So we had no communication. We were on a shingle road. A logging truck actually just about put us off that road. So by the time we arrived up there, we were really experiencing what it was like to live up there. And I think even for us that think we live rural, that was a really big picture for us to get up there. So I talked to the principal of the school up there, who's part of the Respectful Relationship program. He has his very small school, and he has to run it across 2 campuses because With schools closing down now, both of these schools close, so they have like a consolidated school, but he does half the week in one and half the week in others, so schools can, that students don't have to travel so far for the whole week. His student community, some travel for an hour and a half into Orbost, which is the closest town. Others actually travel over the border into New South Wales for services. So I think getting our head around that has been really difficult, or not difficult, but it's been really important to get our head around it, to know how to work with the communities. Impacts, like rural communities, their health outcomes overall are so low, and I think that also different from metro. And I think that we know that a lot of people live below the poverty line up in those rural communities. They're really, respectful relationships in the school is not on their agenda at all. So getting that community buy-in is really different. And yet you come into a town, say like Bensdale or Latrobe Valley, and there's different aspects of that. There's big unemployment with, the coal industry shutting down. There's the dairy farming. So there's just so many aspects. And I know that happens in a metro context as well, but I think these communities all impacted so much by just one little change. So I think in terms of what to do, I'm not sure if I have a lot of those answers, but I think it's really important to make sure we listen to the people in the community and adapt as they need. I might ask, you're, in Geelong, and I know you work out to Colac and quite sort of geographically diverse locations. Do you kind of have other things to add to that?
So we have a really diverse range of schools, small schools with 2 teachers and less than 10 students, right up to huge secondary schools in Geelong CBD. They all have their diverse needs, and our support's really tailored to them. I think of this role as not too different to teaching, to be honest. We need to teach to the point of need, ensure that all of our students are reaching their goals, even if it looks different from student to student. And really it's not too different for our schools in supporting them with the whole school approach. They're all starting at different places, they're all choosing different goals and journeys to begin with. So I think there's a bit of a balance between the consistent approach and supporting schools, especially in such a diverse range of settings and contexts. So we have some schools that choose to have us present the one PD split into 4 at a staff meeting because they're unable to get the whole staff out or any staff out. There's considerations around CRT coverage in rural communities. So then we might provide them with the funds, but there's not actually CRTs to cover those schools. So it's sometimes not as easy as just providing the funds. But then having said that, we've got some small schools that we've been able to have one staff member attend each of our training around the 4 Rs, the resilience, rights, respectful relationships, teaching and learning materials. Each time we've ran that, they've sent one person, and now we've got 100% coverage, which is pretty fantastic. So I think there's sort of sometimes really great things about small schools, and other times there's some challenges. So it's sort of the same really as anything, that there will always be difference. I think we've found that we needed to really run some more PD around topics 7 and 8. So for people who know the 4 Rs, so around gender and identity and positive gender relations. So again, we've really worked with some fantastic stakeholders in our area, CASA, who are here today, who have been instrumental in that, GASP, our Gender and Sexuality Project, and Vic Legal Aid, in providing a day that we've called Foundation Knowledge for topics 7 and 8. So after staff have attended the 4R training, then going into more depth into that, because some of those topics are quite new. So some schools haven't needed that extra additional layer, but some really have in terms of consent and the law, age of consent, gender and sexuality diversity, and sexual assault prevention. So I think we've really just tried to tailor everything as much as we can, and sometimes that's around a variety of settings, whether it's a specialist re-engagement setting, a Catholic school, a primary school, a secondary school, a rural school, or a large school. So yeah, I think for me, I keep coming back to this thing that we need flexibility within the consistent approach, and that all of us are working tirelessly to meet the schools at where they're at and be on the ground, which I think is where we're getting the benefit from.
Yeah, thanks, Ash. That's the real interesting challenge, isn't it, about how you do the consistency at the statewide level, but also make sure that you're tailoring at the local level. I want to turn to Slido, because our top-rated question at the moment with 47 likes says, how do you deliver RRE, respectful relationships education, to culturally and linguistically diverse students? And what are some of the challenges you've encountered? Jeremy, I might hand to you to have a first go at this question.
Yeah, it's a good question, and for context here, Melbourne High School has representation from over 70 different cultural and language groups. The first thing you're negotiating is that, as we would be aware, they're going to then come to this both from a family and a cultural perspective with their own learning about a whole range of issues that relate to gender, family violence, and you have to some extent, engage with that without diluting the key messages. And I think success to that is about engagement with community. You don't and can't place a young person in the situation where there is one message going in one ear and a different one at home. And you're placing them in a really invidious situation if you do that. So unless you're engaging with family and the community, and to some extent that's a tougher job, you're going to place those young people in a very awkward position. So I don't know if I have the solutions to it, but that's the problem. You actually do need to engage with the community and work with, as we've heard from a number of occasions, where that community starting point is. But there are some things that are going to have to be givens, and if that means that you are re-educating that community, then that's what you have to do.
Did anyone else want to add to that one? Go, Ash.
I just wanted to add and agree with Jeremy that it is around engaging families and the wider community. Before I was in this role, I worked at Northern Bay College in Cryo, Norlane. So really highly diverse school, and we also had a whole school approach to sexuality before respectful relationships came in. And I think some of the sort of successes from that was around engaging community leaders from multiple faith organisations. I think there was some really fantastic community liaison staff that were employed by the school but working within those communities. We did some really fantastic YouTube videos that were in appropriate diverse languages for our school community, explaining the importance of the work that was happening in schools. And I think that schools with diverse populations really, they need to be creative about having those conversations, because we would sometimes have these events and be like, we're just going to have all these families rock up, and it's not as easy as that. So you need to sort of engage leaders, send out text messages and YouTube videos, and Respect for Relationships, we have some things getting developed into different languages now as well, which is really great from Department of Ed. So I think we need to be really having those conversations with families and educating around the importance of why we're doing this work.
Thanks, Ash. Cara? Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in and sort of talk about intersectionality and working with schools to not only develop their prevention practice, but their intersectional prevention practice. And do a shout out to Pam, one of my team who's out there in the crowd today. She's been working on a tool that will be available later in the year, which has an activity attached to it, but it's stepping through intersectionality at an individual level, which is something that we have up on our website and that DVRCV and many others are doing in training. But this is actually looking at intersectionality, recognising the ecological model that the school sits within. And we're hoping to be able to, I think, Ash, you've already spoken to Pam about this, about, testing this out with some schools, testing it out with some other organisations working in this area, and hoping that it might be something that will be really practical to support you in your work.
Thanks, Cara. Alison? Yeah.
Just really quickly wanted to say that it's why the work needs to be multi-pronged, doesn't it? So the work that's happening in schools needs to be reinforced by messages that people are getting through other parts of their day-to-day life as well, which we know from, the broad evidence base on preventing violence against women.
And that's really that whole school approach, isn't it, really? Making sure that we've got that community sector. And Ash, you talked about working with sporting clubs this evening. Like, that's a great example of, when we're talking about respectful relationships, we don't want to be just talking about students. We're talking about it as a workplace. We're talking about it as a community. There's some fantastic questions coming in, and I just feel bad because I don't think I'm going to be able to get through them all. I know that there's a few people in the room that are doing respectful relationships, but either in an early childhood setting or in a university setting. One of the questions that maybe I'll hand to you, Cara, just to have a first go at is, how do we tackle including respectful relationships in university teaching degrees as a first point? But I'm also interested in how do we sort of push the respectful relationships work more broadly in universities as well?
Definitely. So with, pre-service training for teachers, Deb Ollis and I think Maria Delaney's in the crowd. There's been several that have, Jeremy, you've probably also been involved in it, several who have been leading this way, and I think Deakin University has been one university that has been offering this as part of their teaching degree. As I understand it, and anyone from the university sector can correct me, there is a lot of if, buts and maybes. So it's up to that university to bring that on. It's then part of an elective that the student then has to choose. And then they have to end up in a school where they can deliver this. So having a systematic approach and it being based within a teaching degree, I think that that's going to be a very long-term approach. I know that in early childhood education and care, where there is, I think, a little bit more mechanisms for national or consistent leveraging within the skills capability package, if I'm calling it the right thing. I think there are some people there that responding to family violence has been something that's grown over the last bit, but they're also looking at including prevention of violence against women and a gendered approach to that prevention in there as well. I think, we talk about the whole school approach, and it's just something that rolls off our tongues now. It's become a term that, we've really pulled from education because they've been doing it everywhere. And other settings that are looking at how they can fulfil their role in preventing violence are also looking at this as well. So, a whole of workplace approach is something that features in the workplace equality and respect standards. A whole of sport approach is something that we're trying to work with our AFL, rugby league and rugby union partners to look at what does that look like at a national code level. And we actually have some really good leading footy clubs in Carlton and North Melbourne that are also looking at that. What is a whole of sport approach? And in the university space, it's more of a whole of institution. These are massive, massive environments with so much dynamic, just multitude of business within there. What can that actually look like? And I think if a university really conceptualised what an approach to prevention would look like, the component that is to students, so a student receiving training or support, would probably be a really small component, because the area that you get your most influence is what you promote as an institution in every interaction that your staff, that your community and your students have. That is when you should be addressing every driver of violence and promoting equality and respect. So I think that all these settings can really pull from that and look at how we build our systems and our structures to be promoting gender equality in everything that we do.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. Is Helen and Kelly in the room, in the house? Yes, amazing. If you've got a question for the panel, pop your hand up while you're thinking about it. I'm going to ask Alison one more question. I can see some colleagues from the Youth Affairs Council of Victoria in the room, and it's a conversation we've been having about the gaps that exist in the service system, particularly around support for young people, and this came out in the Family Violence Royal Commission as well. It seems like there's an opportunity to change the trajectory through early intervention work, or how can prevention and response sectors work together to address gaps for young people, both who might have experienced intimate partner violence or who might be using violence in their own relationships?
Well, it's really important, isn't it? Because the Respectful Relationships program will be opening up discussion with young people about what are healthy and unhealthy dynamics in their own dating relationships, as well as what might be happening in the dynamics that are at home. But that, you know, there'll be conversations about things like overt jealousy, coercion, control aren't normal. So these issues are going to be raising red flags for some young people that recognise those dynamics in their own dating relationships, and those moments are excellent opportunities for early intervention. So opportunities to circumvent these ways of relating becoming normal and manifesting then in, you know, what might, you know, further relationships and relationships when they're older people. And that's, you know, both the case for people who are using violence within relationships as well as those who are experiencing it. The difficulty is that we've got major gaps in our service system. You know, for example, we've got few dedicated services that exclusively work with young people experiencing and indeed using family violence, and that includes, you know, working with young people who are experiencing violence in their own dating relationships as well as their parent and carers. This is, you know, particular challenges we've heard from Jan in rural and regional communities where there's just the dearth of services. And I think it's a really big question in the post-Royal Commission environment for how we build capacity of all the services who've got a role to play. So it's not the purview of just the specialist service system, but it is about building the capacity of the specialist service system to work better with children and young people. It's about building the capacity of youth services to handle the issue of family violence and violence against women more broadly. It's about, you know, we know that family violence is a major driver of youth homelessness, so it's about skilling and equipping up our homelessness service system. And it's of course about building the capacity of teachers and other staff within schools to be able, within the bounds of their own roles, to be able to recognise what they're seeing, respond appropriately, and have the relationships developed in their particular areas to then refer into the specialist system.
I'm going to take this as an opportunity to open up to the floor. Do we have any questions?
Hi everyone, thanks for having all of us. Coming from ethnic background, I've got a question. Part of the panel suggests that learning or training to prevent violence against young people, especially young women. How can we reach them at home? A lot of ethnic background, they can't leave home because of background rules and also for financial. So if we reach school, we're reaching the young people, but we want to reach the people at home. How can we do that? Or how can us as a community leaders within our own ethnic community can help that as well? Thank you.
So you don't want to keep that?
I'll have a start with that, but that's really the big question, isn't it? Schools are a good starting point. Emily made the point earlier that schools are the single, now universal community portal. Every family that has a child is connected to a school. So we can provide, if you like, the opportunity, but that's in a way all we can provide. We, in the end, can have an educative role within our community and with our families, but we cannot mandate or direct change within a family or a community sector. That's why I think the point that Cara made about how important intersectoriality is going to be with this, because schools can open up the conversation, but we can't close that conversation, in my experience. That's going to need a whole of community approach.
I think it's a really, really good question, and I think that it's something that goes to the name of this conference, in that it's going to take generations to create the change that we want to create. And that's not saying that we shouldn't be trying everything, but as Jeremy says, schools is an entry point to a near universal reach to every Australian home. So it's a fantastic starting point. Change the Story, that the National Framework for Preventing Violence Against Women talks about reaching people where they live, work, rest and play and learn. And you've heard this morning definitely from the Minister and from others about all different approaches to preventing violence against women. So that might be happening in the workplace, it might be through community leaders like you mentioned just before, it could be in the faith-based context, it could be the sporting leaders that Ash is speaking to later today, or it could be the television ads that are currently running and the campaigns that the Victorian government and other governments are putting out into the public discourse and debate. We really want people to be seeing reinforcing messages, and it's only through that this change can start to build into a momentum that will just keep going for that generational change that we want.
And Jan, building on that question, I guess there's an interesting observation here about the role of the community sector and how they can support this work across settings, not just sort of within an education context. Do you have any kind of examples of the community sector role supporting more broadly?
I think that we can't underestimate the people that are in the communities, and these include like the neighbourhood house. You know, neighbourhood houses are the livelihood of rural communities, and the one sort of small regional hospital, district hospital that has one person allocated for the whole picture of health promotion, but out of their own, I guess, goodwill, they see this as really important and choose to get skilled up in knowledge so that they can support their community. So it might not be within their position description, but it's certainly what they do.
Thanks, Dan. We have a question from the floor.
Oh, hi. Thanks so much for your panel this morning. I'm a schools program officer at White Ribbon Australia, and I'm also a member of the Equality Rights Alliance Young Women's Advisory Group. So I'm particularly interested in where young people, and particularly young women, sit in this space. So I was wondering, any of you on the panel, what your thoughts are on, I guess, opportunities for where you see young people fitting into, you know, leading some of these conversations to make sure that the whole of school approach is informed by young people's views?
That's a great question, though. Honestly, it's the most exciting part of our work. I think we can't be having these conversations if we're not engaging students and engaging families and the wider community. So I guess from a practical point of view, in our journey in respectful relationships in Barwon is that right from the beginning we were really keen to make sure we had students at the very front of this conversation. I have come from a very strong student voice and community engagement background, so it kind of made sense that that's what we needed to be doing. We developed a sort of condensed version of the original respectful relationship audit and shifted the focus to students. Some of our lead schools, it certainly was more of an additional resource that schools may want to use. I think casting the net as wide as possible to seek feedback, to develop an action plan and think about priorities for a school is a good thing. So we supported the schools to gather data about where they were at. And I guess often we might think in schools we're doing something, but are the students actually seeing that, or are the families actually seeing that? So initially that was our very first step. And there was some fantastic feedback that schools had that was generated some fantastic discussion and action plan goals. We've had schools that have, similar to, I guess, a school-wide PBS framework, have got students on their respectful relationships teams, have families on their respectful relationships teams as well. We also last year, with support from VicSRC, ran a student voice forum. So that was around building understanding of respectful relationships. It was just with our lead schools, so with our 11 lead schools. What's respectful relationships? What is student voice? How can we get involved in this in our schools? What are other schools doing already kind of learning? Then from there, we actually developed a student voice toolkit, or a bit of a handbook, I don't know what the right word is, flyer, brochure, to support schools to be able to take back to their schools. So we used a lot of the ideas that students generated in that first forum last year. We used some tools with permission, obviously, from VicSRC, with planning, how to get students to engage in conversations around respectful relationships, and some planning tools. And also some positive stories, some snapshots from what our schools have already been doing, and some quotes and things from students. We then, from that toolkit, have then developed the next rollout of student voice forums this year. And we've now, I would say, close to 400 students in Geelong have attended those sessions. And we put it out to our lead schools of who had the capacity to want to take on. It was a big ask, but we had one of our schools, St Joseph's College, take on the student voice forums. So I actually met with them, probably their student leadership team, 4 times, one of which was in the holidays, which was, back in my day, I wouldn't have went to school in the holidays, but I was very impressed with their dedication. Respect for relationships is their sort of cornerstone for their student leadership team this year. So with the students, we've co-planned and co-facilitated over 6 student voice forums in the area, and using the sort of toolkit as a guide around what is respect for relationships, and how can we have students involved. And I honestly feel like I don't even need to be at those forums anymore, and that the students are just absolutely running with it. And it has been, for me, my biggest highlight in this work in 18 months is to see our schools engage in this. We now have the students that have attended those forums then sort of do similar, go back to their school and carry that forward with them as well. So we've sort of, my work is always around building the capacity of students. We don't know, well, we didn't know a month ago if we would be here after June 30, so there was no point me running everything. So we really worked with schools to say, okay, yeah, we can give you a day, we can give you as long as you need, but I want your students to meet with me before we do that, so that we can really make sure that your students are ready to run with that in case our support looks different in the new year. So, yeah, it's been amazing.
It's definitely like an area that, you know, for the future of the conversation over the next few years, that I think there'll be more and more kind of coming out around how, you know, implementation teams can be working with students and really empowering that student voice. It's actually something we want to do a seminar series on, you know, in the next 6 months as well. Was there any other questions from the audience? I see someone down the front here.
I'm just wondering, for children with disabilities, how you go about identifying that. I'm interested in if there's any special schools signed up in this program. I work in disability, so frequently children don't even really honestly understand that they're being treated poorly and not equally, and all of these things that we're talking about. So, and there's a lot of different sorts of disabilities. So how are you sort of managing that from that area?
I know of at least one special school that's in the rollout, but I believe that there would be more. And I think if you'd ask maybe Pam over there in lunchtime, or anyone from the DET team, they'd be able to tell you. But looking at disability, it's also sort of speaking to that intersectionality and building the understanding in our prevention practice to take into those considerations of the ableism that is experienced by young people with disabilities, and making sure that we're incorporating that into our prevention practice as well.
So we have 5 specialist schools and 1 re-engagement setting within our cohort. And to be honest, I think that our specialist schools are maybe doing better, because social emotional learning is the bread and butter. So we've been having some fantastic conversations around how best to support our specialist schools. And definitely there's a fantastic resource from Family Planning Victoria around sexuality and respectful relationships education in specialist schools. And we've been using both the 4Rs and those resources to support schools with their curriculum mapping and planning. So we're actually currently, there's a group of specialist schools, there's a number of our Respect for Relationships project leads that are working with specialist schools to map and look at content descriptors from the A to D curriculum as well, and start thinking about some activities that might support that. The VCAA website has some fantastic resources as well that I'd really recommend checking out, and maybe have a chat to your, I'm not sure what area you're in, but your Respect for Relationship project lead would probably be able to support you around specialist settings. I think across the whole, we're having some really great success in specialist schools.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question about timing. One of the question that's come through Slido is the program's been funded for 2 more years. Do you think that 3.5 years is enough to get this work embedded in schools?
The short answer is no. We all know this. To embed significant cultural change, particularly around an issue which is going to, I think, have a otherwise natural flow back into bad and old patterns, all of the research would tell us that's a minimum of a 5-year to a 10-year cultural shift. It's good to see that the program has been refunded, because the other thing to remember, of course, is that whilst we are halfway through the initial 3-year period, the majority of schools haven't come on board yet. And if the funding was then going to lock out at the end of the 3 years, they would have just started. So there is going to be a need to continue to underpin the momentum that's been happening through the programs for, I would suggest, 5 to 10 years.
Let me go to a question that I got quite a few stars. I've got to see if I can find it. It was relating to the Herald Sun. It's actually a topic that we're having a breakout session on after lunch around managing backlash and resistance. And we've already heard a little comment about the Herald Sun article in the paper last week. The question to the panel is, how do we get the Herald Sun to calm down? No, seriously. How do we get the media to work in conjunction with us in this space?
I can talk a little bit about that. At our Watch, we've got a national media engagement program where we've got a cross-disciplinary, I can never say that word, team of journos, or ex-journos now, and prevention practitioners working together, engaging with media. So we have a national media advisory group that has a lot of, I'm not sure if the Herald Sun is on it, but a lot of sort of the, the big decision makers and the big journalists. And, cultural change takes time. It doesn't matter which setting, it takes time. Media is such an important way that Australians receive messages and hear about the news, obviously, but it is something that will take a very, very long time. And I think what Jeremy was saying before is really, really important. To create the cultural change, if we've got sort of 100% is this, and there might be 10% here of people who are they're never going to play the game, they're never going to come to the party. What we want to do is grab this 50% in the middle and just nudge them along. If we spend all the time on this 10%, we're going to just run out of energy. We all work enough. We all want to go home and enjoy our weekends. So let's concentrate on the middle people who do want to change, and we've got the data. It says they are interested in changing and challenging the way that society is, and let's nudge them all a little bit that way.
Can I sort of interject a note of real concern and caution around this for the same reason, the same proposition that Cara's just describing. The schools who put their hands up first to be involved were the early adopters. They were the ones who were already committed. You were preaching to the converted. The ones who haven't come on board are the ones that are going to be the hardest work, and they're yet to come on board. And I was very mindful of the last 2 points on Emily's slide about the sorts of challenges that respectful relationships will face, because I think they go together. One is that concept of backlash. The other is the risk of losing those underpinning propositions around a pro-feminist approach and gender, and it's already happened. If you're not aware, the material itself was filtered for risk aversion by the Department of Education. Some of that material was the first to go, and it's particularly back-ended to the last couple of units, which was the point that Ash made before. And they're the ones that schools that come on board that are simply doing it because of compliance, and that's what will happen, they will further filter out those absolutely fundamental messages. And there's a real risk that that's what will get lost. I think we even saw a little bit of it in that video, where there's a risk that schools will revert to what they're comfortable with, which is basically a personal development and social skills development framework, not a gender and pro-feminist framework. And you're going to hit that with these schools that are going to come on later.
Yeah, fantastic. And we know if we're not addressing the gender drivers, then we're not actually doing primary prevention. So I think that's a really critical message.
Sorry, can I just add a comment?
Jump in, Jen.
Just in terms of the people that are out there delivering it as well, and certainly that backlash and the importance of self-care. And we know that and I've talked about it in rural locations, we have a lot of people who do the work as part of goodwill, and so they don't have the support systems in place. And so we have had a lot of requests to deliver something around backlash, and specifically looking at connecting that to workers' self-care and the sustainability of people in positions doing this. It's really important.
Is there any final questions from the audience? Burning questions? Yes, just down the front.
Hi, yeah, my name's Michael. I work in adult mental health and here in Melbourne. I was wanting to direct a question to you, Jeremy. If you could explain a little bit more about why you see the pro-feminist and gender agenda as being so central and so crucial to this endeavour. Thanks.
I wouldn't have thought I would need to be asked that question in this room. Look, if we boil it all down, gendered violence will not disappear until every male in the universe gets it. And that's not going to happen until we change the current patriarchal, misogynistic hegemony that still exists within masculinity. Until we reconceive masculinity in a pro-feminist frame and in an anti-gender violence frame, this problem will perpetuate. And that's the core of the problem, if we're honest about it. So it's programs like this that are going to need to engage with this and are going to need to engage with this, because in the end, the real work we're doing is we are reconfiguring masculinity. And I think unless we do that, and that can only happen, in my view, from a pro-feminist framework, then we're probably wasting our time.
Mm-hmm. Cara, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I wanted to quote someone that is in the audience, but I won't necessarily say her name if she doesn't want to. Schools have been talking about respect for decades. Australian community has been talking about respect for decades, and there's been no change in the rates of violence against women and family violence. So we've got the evidence that shows that we need this gendered analysis, and we need to transform the way that our gender is portrayed in our society, and that's why we need to keep those things focused.
Thanks, Cara. I've got a final question for the panel, and we've probably got about 30 seconds each. Looking forward over the next 5 years, what is the one thing that you would like to see either happen, progress, or develop in the Respect for Relationships education space?
Will I start? I just want to start by actually telling a little story which sort of supports it. So last night I jumped on the train to travel down here for today, and I happened to sit next to two school principals of lead schools that were coming down for a conference, and so I used the opportunity to ask them what was important for them, and they said the biggest the biggest resource they have is the human resource of the staff that sit in the project office and deliver the work. And I know in Gippsland, the 4 people that do the work there are just remarkable, and we have weekly, daily contact with our office and across the 4 of them. So I think that the continuation of that human resource, those people that the schools can go to for the expertise and get a prompt answer is the most important thing in our view.
I just wanted to reflect on what Ash was saying before about not needing to even be in the room because the kids themselves are picking up this dialogue. And when I'm not at work, I spend a lot of time eavesdropping on my teenage daughter and her friends, and that fills me with an enormous amount of optimism because, this program and what they're doing at school is really tapping into the zeitgeist, right? So, they're taking ownership of this. They're leading the discussion and they're influencing their peers. And that's awesome.
I think the momentum and the energy, even today being here, and it is incredible to hear the continued investment in funding in this space is fantastic. And I do think we're on the right track. But I think it's about continuing to strengthen our partnerships with each other across organisations, across Catholic and secondary schools, government schools. I think it's about that shared goals and shared visions, and really, I think we're already sharing so many resources already today. There's a number of people I want to touch base with and talk to and hear their ideas. So I do think we're on the right track, and we're sort of at this point where we're trying to get some consistency probably in the next few years, and some consistency in our workforce and some consistency in our resources and generating that evidence base, which the statewide evaluation for respectful relationships will hopefully also contribute to that evidence base and show us that we are making some changes. So I think it's consistency and just keeping up with that momentum and shared goals and being here and having this conversation.
Thanks, Ash.
I don't think it's possibly the most important thing, but I think particularly in the context of this conference and who we have in the room, it's probably the most important urging, and that is that we need to build those alliances and partnerships across sectors. I don't see that happening in the Respectful Relationship program at a systemic level. It's certainly happening on the ground in local levels, but it's not happening systemically. So if there was something else I was going to build into the architecture, it would be those cross-sectorial links and partnerships.
And I would really like some longitudinal data. It's a world first of the scale that's happening now, and we can see from anecdotal data, from the observations of teachers and principals, that it is having a positive impact. But I think having data that actually shows how it's changing the trajectory and the perpetration and victimisation rates of young people as they grow into adults would just be an absolute game changer.
Thanks. It's exciting times, and I'm so grateful for all of your contribution today. The conversation was incredible, and we'd pre-prepared some questions, but actually we ended up touching on sort of everything that we wanted to cover. So great conversation, everyone. Thank you all for your questions from the audience and on Slido. Please give a big round of applause to Jan, Alison, Ash, Jeremy and Cara.